On this week's Carrier Wrap, we wrap up our coverage of the recent Competitive Carriers Association event with a look at a session dedicated to policy challenges of 5G. Well, thanks for joining us on this week's Carrier Wrap. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. Well, for this week's show, we finish up our coverage of the recent Competitive Carriers Association's Mobile Carrier Show in Nashville, where I moderated a panel discussion looking at 5G policy challenges. Joining me in the discussion were representatives from T-Mobile US, Nokia, Qualcomm, the FCC, and the DC-based law firm of Telecommunications Law Professionals. The discussion looked at several topics seen as challenges to the continued development and eventual deployment of so-called 5G technologies, with a strong emphasis on policy moves. Topics included insight into what panel members expected from still-to-be-defined 5G standards, what they expect network planning to look like for the rollout of 5G services, how the FCC should look at spectrum allocation for 5G, seeing as a government agency has never tied specific spectrum bands to any one technology, what spectrum bands are expected to be part of the initial 5G deployments, and a look at different spectrum models using shared assets or tapping into unlicensed spectrum bands. The video is a bit lengthy, but it is definitely packed with some great insight. So let's take a look at that interview now. All right, so maybe we'll get started here. The panel members were all good. Okay, well, my name is Dan Meyer. I'm Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. Thanks for coming in after lunch here for a session to look at policy challenges of 5G. We have a pretty distinguished panel, a full panel, as you can see, of guests to provide their commentary and their insight into the topic. So I will keep my commentary to a minimum to allow them to speak as much as possible. But I think most people have seen probably the description for the panel, so no need to go over that. But what I'll do is I'll start off with just having the panel members introduce themselves quickly and who they're with. We don't have any long bios for everybody, so if you guys want to know more about these people, you can either just Google them or ask them afterwards. Their life stories. So, but we'll start on this end over here with Michael from T-Mobile. Michael, I'll start off first.
Michael Amon from T-Mobile. I'm in corporate development, so I primarily buy and sell the spectrum, but I do work with our government affairs team on regulation related to spectrum.
Brian?
Brian Hendricks. I'm the head of technology policy and government relations for Nokia in North and Latin America.
And Johanna?
Hi, I'm Johanna Thomas. I work at the FCC for Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, and I'm her wireless, international, and public safety legal advisor.
Okay. And Jessica?
Hi, I'm Jessica Gyllstrom. I'm an attorney at Telecommunications Law Professionals based in Washington, D.C.
And John?
I'm John Kuzin. I represent Qualcomm at the Federal Communications Commission, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. as well.
Great. All right. Thanks, guys. And the plan will be, we have a few, kind of prepared questions for everybody. We'll go through some topics here. And then we plan on leaving, 15 minutes or so at the end for any questions from you guys in the audience there. So if you have some of those questions, feel free to have them saved up. Oh, we got water coming in too. Very good. So make sure if you have any questions for the end, feel free to save those up. And so what we'll do, and also I've been at some of the sessions earlier today. Thank you. Everybody seems to need to comment on the fact that there is a spectrum auction going on right now, so there might be some commentary that we'll have to kind of work around, but that's okay. I think we're all familiar with that. So anyway, some water. So we'll start off with, obviously, the panel topic is 5G and policy challenges, and not to kind of beat this topic to death, I think we've all been in conversations either here or previously about what 5G is and the importance of that. So I thought maybe we just get that out of the way quickly and maybe just get, maybe some commentary from those on the panel about what they think 5G, maybe the core benefits of 5G, what 5G will be, what it will bring to the market. And I'm guessing, too, it'll kind of maybe each person might have to build on the previous person because I think we all kind of have a standard idea of what it's going to be. Maybe we can start off with, maybe on this end with just Michael, kind of your general view of 5G. Obviously, I know T-Mobile as a carrier is very interested in 5G and has now announced some stuff recently about it as well. But maybe start with you and just kind of build yourself down the line there. But what your general views of 5G are?
Yeah, so I think it's really a kind of a hodgepodge of technologies that get lumped together. But there are, some key pieces that I think we've probably heard in the past 2 days. Ultra low latency, very high capacity, high speeds, and a lot of connections that can be attached to the network at one time, which is why sometimes IoT and 5G get kind of mixed up, because that's one piece of 5G is IoT connections, or massive amounts of IoT connections on one sector or one cell site. Those seem to be the kind of the key drivers. There's I guess a couple other ones, device-to-device connections that are outside of the cellular network. That's another aspect.
Okay. Hey, and can everybody hear okay in the back as well? I know it's kind of a small room. We have microphones. Everybody can hear okay? Okay. If you can't hear okay, throw your arms up. We can go from there. Sorry, Brian.
No problem. I usually don't need a microphone. That's probably a bad thing. From Nokia's perspective, building on what Michael just said, I mean, we view 5G as the technology foundation for the connected world. It will be the forward-looking networks that enable the mobile Internet of Things and all of the use cases that you're hearing people talk about, some of which are capable on 4G networks and evolving 4G networks, some of which will challenge use cases, autonomous driving and other things that are coming. So it's all the technology that will enable that. There's a lot of risk, a lot of new R&D work that has to be done, but it is all designed from Nokia's perspective to try to drive down the cost of deployment. We want the infrastructure to do more, but have lower power consumption costs, lower maintenance and deployment costs, try and get coverage and density in places that we haven't achieved that in previous generations. So the only thing I guess I quibble with in the topic sentence of the question is, I don't think Nokia believes is years off, plural. I would draw your attention to some of the comments that our CEO Rajiv Suri made at Mobile World Congress, where we actually believe you'll start seeing deployment of 5G capable systems next year. Those are things that can be upgraded obviously into 5G, but they're the early foundation, and you're going to start to see that next year. Hopefully in the United States, which we'll talk about, we think is at risk, I think, at some level of slipping behind other markets in the world with the policy environment.
Yep. Okay. Very good. And Johanna?
So as most of us know here, 4G networks for the most part operate on 3 gigahertz of spectrum or below. And for 5G, one thing Commissioner Rosenworcel believes is that we're going to have to bust through that 3 gigahertz ceiling and start looking at spectrum at 24 gigahertz and below. Of course, at this spectrum, at that high band spectrum has some propagation challenges, so we're going to have to make it work. We're going to have to look at spectrum blocks of 200 megahertz, contiguous spectrum blocks of 200 megahertz or more. We're also going to have to combine this spectrum with the dense network of small cells to take advantage so that we can kind of deal with some of the propagation challenges, but those 3 pieces combined will help carriers deliver faster speeds than we've seen before.
Okay. Jessica?
I don't really think it'll come as a surprise to anyone to think that, data-driven mobile service is the future. The number of devices are increasing, the data usage is skyrocketing. So I think any future, technology such as 5G really would have to account for that by increasing capacity as well as data speeds. I think those two are extremely important to any new technology.
Okay. And John?
Yeah, just 2 points I will make. I'm reminded of one of my first bosses when I was working as an engineer at Bell Communications Research, when I gave him 2 options. His name was Dave Eigelhart, and I said, Dave, do you want me to do A or B? And he looked at me with all seriousness and said, yes. And I looked at him, and as a brand new engineer of 21, I kind of said, what? But when you look at 5G and your question is it going to be what type of spectrum? It's going to be all kinds of spectrum. It's going to be the millimeter wave stuff that Johanna spoke about. It's going to be sub 3 gigahertz stuff that is in use now for 4G, 3G, 2G, et cetera. And it is going to be the bands in between. It's going to be between 3 and 28 gigahertz. Whatever bands are available in areas where there's a high demand for capacity, those bands are going to be used. And one other additional point on spectrum is going back to Dave Eigelhart, is it going to be licensed or unlicensed? The answer to that is yes. It will be both, and it's going to need to be both. And we're all working towards supporting networks that operate using both types of spectrum. And just from a 10,000-foot level, how I envision 5G being is there was a concept discussed more than a decade ago called seamless mobility, where you won't have to think, wherever you go, you'll have connectivity. I truly believe that 5G will be that seamless mobility world where a user is going to have a device, set it up, and it will automatically connect and provide whatever you want on that device through the cheapest mode possible, whether that's an unlicensed link. The device is going to have smarts inside of it to know what you typically look at, so that it will download it to the device. If you read the New York Times every morning, when you get up, it's just going to be on your device. And even if you go into a train tunnel with no connectivity, you'll have access to what you want, very low cost, anywhere, anytime, and it will be without you having to worry, am I on Wi-Fi? Where's my type of connection? It's just going to work, and I think we're moving very close to that.
Okay. Brian, did you have another comment?
No, I wanted to underscore a very important point that he just made, because I think the way we're looking at the 5G world, incrementalism and uncertainty are kind of the biggest the dangers here. And so when we're thinking about what we're hoping to accomplish with lowering the costs of deployment and expanding throughput and dropping latency and dealing with demand bubbles and all the things that 5G can hopefully care for, it's going to require an all-of-the-above approach on spectrum. And so Johanna's boss has actually been one of the key people talking about that. We need spectrum at lots of different levels. We certainly would like to see more below 6 gigahertz, but we're very active in the spectrum frontiers proceeding, and I'm very happy the commission is moving forward there. It's really going to, the more flexibility you can give the vendors to design equipment capable of utilizing multiple frequency bands, the better the solutions are going to be, and the better your options are in terms of cost.
Got it. Okay. Well, before we dig too much more into the spectrum aspect, and obviously all the answers, spectrum is a big part of what 5G is going to be, and it's going to be a multi-band type of deployment, licensed, unlicensed, almost anywhere you can get spectrum. It sounds like it. You have to try to stitch together to support 5G. But as part of that, there is going to be the network aspect of this, whether it's small cells or antennas in different places. And I wanted to kind of, touch on that a little bit, because I think for smaller carriers, that might be a bit of a challenge for them, because they operate perhaps in a different model than larger carriers do when it comes to cell site deployments and backhaul and different challenges like that. And I know yesterday during one of the keynotes, Stephen Bai from C Spire had mentioned that bringing more spectrum into play, obviously the challenge becomes in how you support all that spectrum at a cell site. You can't just keep throwing out more and more antennas. Some of these sites, like he was saying, are 15 to 20 years old. You have issues about, can these sites handle not just the additional antennas on there. So I guess as you look at, how network planning will play into this, looking at all these different spectrum bands, how does the industry tackle the logistical challenges in bringing spectrum to actual commercial usage? And maybe we can start with Michael on that. Maybe, as you guys look ahead, I know you guys have announced a little bit about your 5G plans, but as you look kind of towards this multi-spectrum band deployment, how do you see the logistics happening and support for that?
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, one point is that, there'll be a very robust 4G LTE deployment for a long time as kind of the foundation for broad coverage across the country. And initially, 5G most likely will be deployed at higher bands, 28, 39. And because of that, that will dictate small cells. So, the deployments will be relatively modest, I think, in the initial. Will be things, initially I think it's fixed, a fixed product, fixed broadband product, last quarter mile, not even last mile, but last quarter mile sort of connectivity. And the one thing about deploying at a high band is that the antennas are actually small.
Sure.
So, there's kind of a relationship. So I'm not sure that it's a particularly difficult deployment because your antennas are small at higher frequencies like that. But, there'll be lots of learning over time. But again, it would be all kind of built on a foundation of 4G LTE coverage. It's not like we've seen in the past where you replace 2G with 3G and 4G replaces 3G. 4G will be there for a long time, and there'll be little pockets of 5G for particular use cases in particular environments.
Okay. Not to move down the line there, but yeah, Brian, maybe.
So, in golf, they say play it where it lies is the adage, and I think one thing that we have to be careful of is overgeneralizations. Not that your question's an overgeneralization, but not every carrier is in the same place. Everybody has a slightly different technology roadmap to get to 5G. I think Michael is absolutely right that those that have deployed robust 4G systems are going to be able to get a lot of useful life out of that. There's a lot of things that we're working on at the vendor level. Most of it is built around the idea of driving costs down where we can, because that is central to being able to get greater coverage and therefore greater capacity. So whether it's through network virtualization environments and cloud, whether it's through efforts, as I mentioned, to try to get more out of existing networks. I mean, we just had a solution, for example, announced in the last month and a half, which I encourage you to talk to some of the Nokia folks about, called Fast Mile. You may have heard it talked about here. I'm not an engineer, and I will not attempt to tell you everything that it does, but the idea here is in certain areas where you have a network, perhaps it's 4G, perhaps it is not, the customer will have the opportunity to deploy a self-install kit involving a multi-gain, multi-directional antenna to basically boost performance that they get from an existing network. So I think all those things are designed towards better utilization and monetization of current infrastructure, get you on the technology pathway and roadmap to 5G, and then drive the costs down to help you get there. And that's where the vendors, I think, are trying to focus.
Got it, okay. And maybe, Joanna, obviously from a regulatory perspective, I know the FCC has been doing quite a bit in terms of, making it easier for deployment of the antennas and stuff. What's your general view on support there?
So this is a really great question. As my boss likes to say, infrastructure is the unsung hero of the wireless revolution. As we've heard, small cells are going to be a really big part of what is involved in a 5G deployment. So that means we're going to have to find ways to harmonize municipal practices from coast to coast in trying to figure out how we can deploy these cells in the places that they need to be. The Commission has taken steps to streamline this process and work with municipalities. More can be done and is being done. The Wireless Bureau of the FCC is working hard with the various parties to figure out how to further streamline the practices so that, as Brian has been saying, we can help reduce costs in getting these small cells deployed. That primarily is for outdoor deployments. For indoor deployments, one thing my boss has advocated for is creating the wireless equivalent of LEED certification to recognize those buildings that are 5G ready. We need to find ways to encourage and reward buildings that have built a dense network of small cells and fiber backhaul into the building, and having a certification will not only help standardize that process, but also encourage buildings to do that further, other buildings to do that.
Any more comments down there? Anyone else have any more comments? Jessica?
Sure.
Okay. John?
Yeah, just 2 points to kind of piggyback on what Joanna and Michael and Brian have said. 4G LTE is going to be around for a long time, at least another 15 years, if not longer. And the reason is it's such a robust interface. And when engineers at Qualcomm were looking at what could possibly be part of 5G, many of the ideas that were thrown around actually became part of 4G LTE future versions, because one example is LTE broadcast. Oh, it would be nice in a stadium to send everyone that wants to see a replay of a certain play that occurred on the field at the same time, send them all the same data so they could pull it up. Much more spectrally efficient to do that, and it's being done with LTE. Similar is device to device. The upcoming version of LTE is going to have device to device recognition, where you'll be able to sense devices within a kilometer of where you're located, and that's useful for so many examples. The initial way that's going to work is it's only going to identify another use, and if you want to communicate directly to that user, that communication is going to likely occur on the old network. But future versions, and you could be certain for 5G, will allow direct device-to-device communications without actually taxing the network. And you could think about just how spectrally efficient that is and network efficient, where you don't need to actually have any connection to the network if two devices over a distance of a couple hundred meters can communicate directly. And just one other point on what Johanna said with regard to network deployments. As part of the whole seamless mobility vision, the infrastructure is going to be basically invisible, because the sizes of the small cells that I've seen are about the size of a deck of cards, and that's a prototype. And the deployments are likely going to be on new improved street lamps, that they're going to be integrated in a street lamp. It'll look just like a street lamp, so you're not going to have these, in many cases, huge high towers that you have to worry about where they're going to be, et cetera. It's going to be a lot more of a friendly environment, and that's going to be absolutely essential to if you want to have low-power small cells everywhere.
This is a very critical point that's been made now by a couple of folks that I want to underscore. The access to location dimension of small cell deployments. I'm less confident that the Commission will be able to do much unless it gets additional direction from Congress on this point. I know that folks are not generally a big proponent of preemption, so perhaps Nokia has suggested we look at ways where the Commission could use its convening authority by establishing, for example, sort of a template process that municipalities and others could take a look at for approval of location of these devices, and provide an opportunity for a party that doesn't feel like it's getting that kind of process to appeal to the Commission to get authority to move forward with their project. Because the bottom line is that what we see from a vendor perspective is we have product, there is tremendous interest among our customers in deploying it, but we are having the conversation far too often. I can't get location, I can't get connectivity, or I can't get power. And so all the great ambitions in the world are wonderful, and we certainly would love to sell you more of that infrastructure, but until we correct that problem, it's going to be very, very limiting. And I would just add that in my former life, before working for Nokia, I did work on the Senate Commerce Committee with Johanna's boss, and we had occasion in the last spectrum bill that became law to take a look at some limited preemption over municipalities' ability to approve through their zoning changes to a tower that didn't change the footprint, et cetera. And what we actually found, we have some data, is that the process for carriers to make those kinds of changes and deployments was sped up considerably. And so I think we have enough impetus to believe that if we did something meaningful like this, we could really change the dates and the economics of deployment.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe move on to a little bit, digging more to the spectrum issue of this. I think everybody's mentioned it to an extent that, we expect mostly 5G spectrum to be the high band spectrum. And traditionally, the FCC has never really assigned any sort of generational technology to a spectrum band, but it seems like all the talk I've heard a lot of is, that's kind of what's going to happen with 5G. It seems like there's this, kind of pegging millimeter wave, centimeter wave to 5G services at some point. But maybe, I guess, as we look at what's going to be available, maybe start, Jessica, maybe what's your view on what spectrum do you expect to be part of this, part of 5G, I guess? Maybe start with you on that.
Sure. Well, I think most people in this room probably are aware of the NPRM that the Commission is considering right now on the spectrum frontiers, or the above 24 gig bands. The record, at least on the carrier side, the record largely reflects that mobile will be available and suitable in the 28 gig band, 39, 37, and 64 to 71 gig bands. But I think it's really important to ensure that the Commission stays focused on also clearing up low band spectrum. The below 1 gig spectrum is huge and is so important to our services here. So I think they'll be able to complement each other really well, but it's absolutely necessary to have both to transition to 5G.
Any other comment? Yeah, go ahead, Johanna.
So I completely agree with Jessica, and so does my boss, which is probably way more important than me. On the 28 gigahertz piece, I just want to touch on, as some of you may know, at the World Radio Conference late last year, the International Telecommunication Union, or ITU, decided to study several different bands for 5G, and many of them some of them were considering in our spectrum frontiers. The one band that the ITU decided not to study was the 28 gigahertz band. So my boss has been a big advocate and a strong supporter of making sure that the commission, by the end of this year, complete its work on making the 28 gigahertz band available for mobile use in the United States. This is a band, and I'm sure everyone on this panel can tell you this, is being explored by Japan and South Korea for 5G use, and my boss wants to make sure the United States is a leader in the 5G space, and making sure that we take action on the 28 gigahertz band will be really important to that.
So I mentioned earlier, incrementalism is a concern for us. I think while we certainly are hopeful that 28 gigahertz can get done, certainly hope that is not at the expense of the rest of the items in that NPRM. I think from the vendor's perspective, designing solutions from the very beginning that are capable of operating and supporting in multiple bands is clearly optimal. So we're hoping that would, that the whole thing could get done, but politics and certain bands are easier to move than others are. I will say with respect to 28 gigahertz, I think that we do have to be clear that a lot of what we're talking about, there are incumbent uses in many of the bands that we're talking about for 5G on a shared basis. And that creates in Washington a conflict of interests and tensions. And industry hopefully can work collaboratively, in this case with satellite, to develop that. But just yesterday, I believe there was a bill introduced in the House of Representatives that would establish primary status for all satellite operating in that band. And were that to be enacted into law, that has some real limits.
That'd be very limited.
To what we could do. I'm being charitable. I didn't want to dump on it. But the truth of the matter is that a strategy to confer some legitimacy to satellites' concerns that we're going to work through as an industry? Perhaps. But none of this is easy. And so the extent to which we're able to move a package of these frequencies forward, I think that's always our preference. But beyond the millimeter wave, I think the other thing that Nokia has made very clear is we do need to continue to look below 6 gigahertz for spectrum. We've been very active in the 3.5 gigahertz proceeding. There we see tremendous potential. The ecosystem is actually working pretty well together and coming up with a regulatory frame and sensing technologies and other things that can be deployed there. Nokia has been a big proponent of the language in the Senate's Mobile Now Act that wishes to extrapolate that approach to the rest of the 3 gigahertz band, 3.7, 4.2, and also 3.1 to 3.55. We know there are uses there, but our view is that if we're able to establish a good regulatory framework and a good sensing technology and testing regime, then that could potentially create 1.1 gigahertz of contiguous spectrum to be available on a shared basis, which alone would go a long way in terms of making a down payment on our ability to get to that near zero latency, et cetera. But more importantly, I think it also opens up for smaller carriers the opportunity to access a spectrum band of great value at relatively low cost, whether you used it for fixed broadband or backhaul or things of that nature. So I'd commend that bill to your attention because I think that one is very important. I think it actually has a chance to pass this year, and we fully support it moving forward. But increasingly, we're going to have to look at bands where there are shared uses that you can't just clear out. And so below 6 gigahertz is some of the frequency I'd add to this list.
Okay.
I would just add that we are in active discussions with the satellite community to try to come up with a framework, and I think we have a framework. It's always devil's in the details, but I think there's a framework that can work to coexist in 28, 39.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, just one thing I'll add is, I think a week ago, AT&T and EchoStar provided a proposal into the FCC's docket that includes a number of the elements that the other panelists laid out, and it's, it's great to see that the industries working together to try to look at workable solutions, because, I'm sure everyone would agree, when you have to share a band, it makes things extremely complicated, and it also kind of ties up the other side's ability to be flexible if there's certain constraints you got to operate in, which is why the gold standard is and will remain clearing spectrum, and particularly for the mobile carriers, clearing spectrum below 3 gigahertz, looking at opportunities below 6 gigahertz. But sharing's important. It's also somewhat limiting because of the fact that you have to work around other users of the band that are there, and it's not as open as deploying in a band where you have exclusive rights to the spectrum.
Although, just one other point. The technical limitations are obviously fixed and knowable with sharing. The bigger concern that I think we have expressed is the political limitations on sharing. Because you have incumbent uses from both private industry as well as government, there's always a reflexive, not in my band, there can't be coexistence, we can't do anything. I think our approach has always been, and we'll continue to try to, this as Michael said, to work within industry to make those technical discussions, right, not reflexive ones, because if that becomes the playbook for every band, sorry, I have an incumbent use, you can't coexist here ever, you're betting against technology, which we think is always a mistake, but then the sharing model starts to collapse before we've even really gotten an opportunity to establish it, and that would be a missed opportunity, because yes, we fully support exclusive use spectrum for our customers, and we will always support that, but there has to be more tools in the toolbox for us to be able to move forward, because there's not a lot of green space left in spectrum.
Okay. Well, I guess how important is it then for the government to perhaps start assigning that term 5G to spectrum? I mean, I think there's been talk a little bit on the panel here, but other panels as well about, perhaps the U.S. falling behind in terms of 5G deployments. And it does seem like some other countries are, the governments are focused on really assigning, hey, we're doing this in 5G. There's a spectrum that we're looking to use. Again, like I said earlier, the U.S. has kind of usually had a pretty hands-off approach when it comes to assigning any sort of technology, letting the carriers do what they want to do with spectrum. I mean, does the U.S. need to be perhaps a little more authoritative when it comes to, hey, here, our next spectrum auction?
Honestly, I don't think it matters what you call it. I think the issue really comes down to, as a global vendor, we look and we see great interest in Asia in early 5G deployment among our customers. We've seen research partnerships even recently between Brazil and the European government. Everybody wants to be the leader in 5G. Every country, including Europe, which largely missed out on LTE technology. The U.S. is not going to commit a big bunch of public money, but what you can do is you can establish the right policy environment to enable the innovators in the private sector to actually move forward. And that's where moving, whatever you call it, 5G spectrum, pick your label, a package, the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding, looking at the Mobile Now Act, these things taken together establish a policy framework through which the private sector can actually give the U.S. the ability to maintain leadership.
Obviously, I'm a little biased, but I would say one of the greatest strengths that we have in the U.S. is that we have a flexible use spectrum policy, because it allows the U.S. to be an early adapter as well as a leader when there are technological advancements, and we're not stuck in this, this band has been dedicated for 2G, so we can't make it a 3G band. And I would advocate that we should continue that, because it allows us to, quickly is probably not the correct word, but shift a little bit faster than we otherwise would, and than some other countries have in migrating to the newest technologies that are out there.
What the FCC has done traditionally, and it in my opinion, and I think Johanna and everyone else would agree, is set forth a limited set of technical rules that allow any technology to be deployed there. It's what they've done in the unlicensed bands, and it also allows in the licensed bands refarming. What band will be 5G? Well, it may be a 2G band that's refarmed, or a 3G band, etc. By not specifying that, this band shall be a 4G band, etc. You open up that flexibility and you encourage the experimentation that's needed, and it has worked in the past, and I believe it's the best way for us to move forward.
Just, I mean, one last point, I promise. I think timing is of the essence here, is Nokia's message, because in truth, we're in an election year, and conventional wisdom, as we talked about in the earlier panel, is that nothing can get done. We're still hopeful the Mobile Now Act will pass this year, because the way we're looking at it, I don't see the prospect for legislation as a vehicle next year being a whole lot better. We'll have a new president of whatever party, who will be nominating new people to lead the agencies that are going to have thoughts and inputs on this. New FCC commissioners, new NTIA head, new Department of Defense officials who are going to want to take a fresh look at anything that's been proposed. Those people have to get confirmed, and then a period of time goes by until you're comfortable moving on legislation, at which point it's next fall, and we're coming up on a midterm election year. And so the bottom line is we think that the time is now. We think that this bill in particular is one that's a really good down payment. We think it can pass, so I'd commend to your attention the bill and hope that you would help us push it. And I think we have some confidence that we're going to continue to work with the commission to finalize a basket of these higher band frequencies by the end of this year. But timing matters.
Sure,
Cannot
sure.
wait.
Yeah.
Same with moving on the NPRM.
Yeah.
I mean, that should move through quickly.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Jessica, I mean, I guess, are you seeing pretty good, from what your views into DC, you know, is the government moving at a good pace on this? And are they moving in the right direction in terms of making sure that they are able to kind of support, you know, all these various bands for what 5G is going to be? I mean, are they moving fast enough, and are they moving in the right direction to ensure that the industry itself can not, you know, always have a sufficient spectrum supply to keep moving?
Well, I'm sitting next to a
Yeah, I was
Kuzin
gonna say.
representative, so, you know, I think, honestly, you know, I think we're in the midst of a well-documented spectrum crunch, right? I think everyone out there is aware of it. So, you know, spectrum's a finite resource, it's a scarce resource, and in terms of, you know, the commission moving forward, yeah, it'd be great if they can move as fast as possible, but at the same time, I think moving too fast and making too many mistakes just won't work for us. I think that, you know, ensuring that we're going to be, or we, competitive carriers, are going to be able to utilize the spectrum efficiently and in a competitive manner, and further, you know, enabling innovation is really what we need to be focused on here. So yeah, if it takes them a few extra months to make sure they get it right, so be it.
Okay, got it. All right, well, I mean, we're almost to the Q&A section, but I did have kind of one question that I'd kind of formulated from the earlier panels that I kind of want to put out there before we get to the Q&A part. And it's kind of taking a kind of a view of, you know, again, we are talking about CCA members here, and, you know, obviously it seems like the current administration has done a pretty good job of keeping in mind CCA members' desires, I guess, or needs when it comes to spectrum policy, obviously with the auction that's ongoing that we can't talk about. But it seems like the current administration has been pretty open to that. But that administration could be coming to an end here in the next several months. You know, is there a timing issue tied to that? To, you know, because we don't know what the next administration is going to be. We don't know what their views are going to be towards the CCA members. I mean, is there some sort of issue that maybe CCA members might be a little worried that if this drags on too long, that the next administration could be perhaps not as favorable to their current needs and wants in the market? And how do you react to what, you know, obviously is business timeframes and political timeframes that are coming up? I guess, how do you look at what CCA members might be concerned about here in the near term, and perhaps even long term too? Kind of a wild card question there, but I don't know if someone has any insight on that one. I just made that one up earlier. Pretty good, right? Thank you. Thank you, John.
Go ahead. I'm not usually in the business of telling our customers what they should fear and care about. To me, what I worry about again is that scenario where I think the quote is something like, everything that needs to be said has been said, just not by everyone who feels the need to say it. I think industry is keenly aware of what the spectrum needs are. You know, I mentioned on the earlier panels that the spectrum pipeline is very important for carriers large and small, mostly because it removes from the auction processes this last clear chance bidding phenomena that tends to make licenses very expensive and put them beyond the reach of many people who wish to participate. And so we fully support that. Everybody knows that, creating a pipeline. We know what the limitations are in the Congressional Budget Office about scoring and stopping legislation from moving forward. So what I worry about is that we miss the opportunity with an attentive administration, with incumbent legislators and regulators who seem to understand this, by just falling victim to that conventional wisdom that we cannot get anything done in this next 9 months, and you start all over with people, and you begin the initiation process again. And I think that's a huge missed opportunity.
Okay.
And it seems that, kind of related to that, the change of administration would likely, even if the MPRM on Spectrum Futures gets through, the auction of that spectrum, which is what you really need, could be delayed with the change of administration. And that would be unfortunate.
Any comments? I think, John, did you say some comment earlier, John? Are you good?
No, I was just going to make a quick point, which is, the FCC appears focused to get out the millimeter wave NPRM, and we should all be encouraging that to happen.
Okay.
And same thing with the incentive auction. That was an unbelievable undertaking. It's currently underway, and I hope it's successful as well. And I think whatever spectrum band is available, we should look to support it and move as quick as possible, because all options are on the table. Any spectrum band that could possibly be used for mobile, we should be looking at and exploring. And I remain hopeful that the FCC will get the NPRM out this year.
Okay.
Sorry, the report in order. The report in order.
Okay. All right. Well, again, like I said, I want to have some
know.
Q&A time as well. So I don't know if anybody has any questions from the audience. I've got several more to go. Hey, Paul.
I have Paul Kirby with TR Daily. One for Michael, you said we have a framework in the sharing. Are you talking about that because it's AT&T?
Yeah, I think that's the outlines of the framework and how to share the spectrum. First, like I said, details are that way.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? There's one over here.
I'm just wondering with delay, potentially, it sounds like there's more discussion about delay, which is where the 5G spectrum is going to come from. Are carriers just then going to try to find to self-provision? Maybe have the XO purchased by Verizon, for example, which involves a lot of 20 gigahertz spectrum. There's some other companies that are sitting on very large amounts of high-band spectrum. Are you going, absent the commission moving forward quickly because it gets caught up in these political changes?
Well, I mean,
Why should carriers be self-provisioning and to retain the spectrum otherwise?
well, you're right, the market's not going to wait.
Right.
And to the extent that you are hoping to promote a healthy ecosystem, I mean, we can speak a little bit about this, having just acquired Alcatel-Lucent and knowing the pressures that exist in the vendor ecosystem. You're right. I mean, without the right policy framework on a timeline, again, that goes to risk, uncertainty, and incrementalism. I think we have the opportunity to seize some significant developments this year that will put in place a pathway for a healthy ecosystem over the next several years. And it's just, I think it's one thing for people like me who are based in Washington, like yourself too, to talk about that with lawmakers, but when they actually hear from business people, when they're home in the district, that you don't want them to wait, that this is good, common sense, consensus-oriented legislation or NPRM, that matters, because you're right, the market will not wait. The demand will be there for you to do things which are not always the most rational choices in the long run.
I mean, it's a good point that there is a lot of licensed spectrum already. XO owns most of 28, Straight Path owns most of 39. We own some of 28 and 39 both. So, I mean, there are opportunities, but it will require a report in order to change those to mobile allocations, right? So you need that to be able to go beyond some initial fixed wireless sort of product. Really move into 5G. You need to have that mobile allocation on those bands.
Yeah, there's the mobile allocation issue, and then also, I believe 39 gigahertz is set up as basically an FDD band. So Straight Path, the major license holder, made a proposal that's in the FCC's docket about kind of rejiggering their licenses in order to set up wide swath of spectrum for TDD operations, which is basically what most of the manufacturers are looking to deploy in those bands. So it's a mobile allocation. It's also a rejiggering of the rules to actually allow mobile, because the bands are set up basically now for point-to-point microwave links, if there's any allocation like that.
Well, I mean, I guess in building on that, is it dangerous not dangerous, right word, but is it a challenge then if industry itself is going to go to its own means to get its own spectrum? Does that kill momentum for a regulatory way to then try to, I guess, unify spectrum under certain uses? I mean, if Verizon's getting its own spectrum through acquisitions, it has less of an incentive to work perhaps with other operators to unify that. I mean, is there a challenge trying to make sure all the parties stay on the same page when it comes to unifying spectrum, or is that?
I think both need to happen.
Okay.
So like Kathleen mentioned, the Verizon deal with XO.
Yeah.
The FCC still needs to say you could do mobile in this band.
Yeah.
So like they both need to work in concert together. But in terms of an auction, there likely will not need to be, depending on how the FCC handles it, there likely will not need to be an auction for the current licenses, but there will need to be some kind of recreation of a band plan for the current licenses to have everybody turn their licenses to something that is viable for a mobile allocation. So to answer your question, both need to happen.
Yeah. And obviously, I know CCA members are always big fans of band plans, so I'm sure they'll be open to that. So another question? Yeah.
Following up on that, is there a way to get these different bands into the 3GP process before there's an FCC?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Usually, they could possibly do preliminary work, but to actually, they're going to want to know that, it's truly a mobile band before they're going to really commit and move forward. Because, it's like a manufacturer waiting to make equipment. If the rules aren't there to allow you to use it for a particular band, so it's kind of a chicken and egg issue. But I do think if it looks like there's going to be a mobile deployment in this band, which it definitely does look that way, they can actually do some work. But to your point, are they going to finalize a standard? Probably not.
But some of the bands that we're talking about are global bands, so those they're already included, like 39.
Okay. Any other questions there from the audience at the moment? All right. Well, there was some talk earlier about obviously unlicensed and licensed and sharing of spectrum. It does seem like going forward that's going to be kind of the new normal, I guess, when it comes to freeing up spectrum. I guess, does that work when you look at I guess in rural America? What are the challenges for that? Does it work better? Is it worse? I mean, how should CCA members be looking at, kind of breaking free from what they've done in the past when it comes to buying some low band and high band spectrum, now looking at different ways to utilize spectrum? Do these models work in rural America, and how can they work? I guess, how do they work in rural America? So I don't know. I know for T-Mobile it's probably not such a big issue, but I don't know if Brian or somebody wants to. Is there a difference there with rural America?
And I said this on the Hill panel earlier today, when we talk about licensed and unlicensed, at least in Washington, what that usually means is one comes at the expense of the other. I think that's a very disappointing result. We view spectrum in that these are complements, right? Just as sharing and the model of exclusive use of spectrum to be cleared and auctioned, you need the whole toolkit to be able to look at this. And unfortunately, too often it's positioned as, for there to be more unlicensed, there has to be less licensed. I will say, as I did earlier today, that we believe there is too much focus on unlicensed. We think there's been significant allocations of that. So we'd like to see a little bit more effort to balance the amount of licensed and unlicensed spectrum that is used. Both are important. But we also we want to be careful when we talk about sharing, because it will be, and we think it's an indispensable part of the solution going forward. That's not at the expense of the previous model, right? Both are essential. But in terms of smaller carriers, I think the conversations that we have had with you all is you want lower cost. You want lower cost of acquisition of spectrum resources. You want lower costs in terms of the equipment. You want it to do more. You want it to cost less. You want more of it virtualized. And that's what we're trying to do. And so that's, again, coming back to something like 3 gigahertz. It may not be the only band like this, but we are in the unique position of the fact that the commission is already well down the field on this particular band. The industry is doing testing and collaborative research. Sensing technology is being developed. And so you look at it, and if there's not a technical reason not to try to extrapolate it out to the rest of the band, then you try to do that, because that could be an inflection point. It could change fundamentally things for smaller carriers in terms of giving you that lower cost acquisition. However your roadmap would have you using it, that resource being available gives you options, and options means less cost.
Mm-hmm.
Two things on that. One is, unlicensed actually works well in rural areas
Mhm.
because you don't have as much interference with each other, right? There's less density, so you don't have as much noise in the band. And then on the 3.5, for example, there's less interference because the primary interference is naval radar. So once you get away from the coast, there's very little in that band right now.
Johanna?
Well, sorry. I would just, to piggyback on both of these points, I would say that one thing my boss firmly believes is that the best spectrum policy is to have both unlicensed and licensed airways in the picture. One, as Brian was saying earlier, sometimes people see it as an either or, and it doesn't have to be. I think they both work together. And at the same time, right now the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz bands are where a lot of unlicensed activity happens. The 2.4 is getting fairly crowded. The 5 gigahertz is a little more open, but we're making headway to try to create more spectrum in that band. The 3.5 gigahertz work that we're doing is really interesting because it will allow for both licensee, some exclusive use, but also have an unlicensed component by rule, which will be interesting. I think will offer a lot of different uses for both carriers in urban America as well as rural America. But one thing my boss has certainly advocated for is for what she called the Wi-Fi dividend, which is that for every time we license spectrum for exclusive use, we also have a cut of that for unlicensed. And you can see the commission taking steps in that direction with respect to the reconfigured 600 megahertz band that will occur after the incentive auction. There will be unlicensed use in the guard bands. With respect to millimeter wave spectrum, we're not only thinking about licensed uses there, we're also thinking about expanding the unlicensed band. Right now, there's unlicensed use in the 57 to 64 gigahertz range, and in the millimeter wave spectrum proceeding, we're thinking about expanding that up to 71 gigahertz. And I think the benefit for unlicensed is that it allows for experimentation for a lot of different uses. I think we touched on the Internet of Things and sensors, and one, especially with low band unlicensed use, you can have wireless sensors go. You can use the spectrum to have the technology go further distances, which will help in rural communities and with respect to all different types of uses, farming being an example.
Just on that, on the 64 to 71, we've advocated for half of that to be licensed and half of it to be unlicensed. We think that actually helps this helps the unlicensed because it helps build the ecosystem for equipment and devices. And with 4 gigahertz is quite a bit of spectrum just in that band. Not to mention the other bands that are already unlicensed near it.
Yeah, I mean, we took a similar position, which I think was like maybe 64 to 66 could be set aside for unlicensed. But again, it's an issue of balance. I mean, we fully support unlicensed use, but you're at the point where you'd actually have more under this proposal allocated for unlicensed than for licensed. And that's probably a little bit too far.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like to this point now, I mean, obviously the sharing models that have come out, they seem to be, again, you guys mentioned earlier, they seem to be working to an extent so far. We're still somewhat new to a lot of these broader sharing plans. But going forward, I mean, should we expect, new spectrum resources, like kind of what it sounds like? I mean, is sharing going to be just it's going to be part of it now? I mean, it seems like, kind of with the 600 megahertz, there is the unlicensed part of it and licensed part of it. That's probably going to be a normal going forward. Will sharing be part of that? I mean, are the technical capabilities in place to allow sharing, especially as more usage comes to these different bands? Because that's, again, you can start running into more interference issues, and that's when you might have a tricky situation down the road because there are several people trying to
So what's really interesting
get in
is
there.
we tend to think of the ecosystem as fairly fixed. Carriers, suppliers, etc. What we've actually found, particularly with the commission moving on 3.5, you attracted a lot of comments in that proceeding from untraditional players in this ecosystem. And on the research side, we've been approached by a number of parties about exchanging ideas, and it's opened our eyes to some new possibilities. So this has been a fantastic exercise just from an innovation perspective, the commission. And we're also finding people other than carriers coming to us and saying, well, listen, I'd like to do X or Y with my sports league or what have you, but the spectrum acquisition costs are so high. I really look at sharing as a way that I might be able to get infrastructure that I can deploy at lower cost, and I can build a whole business use case and model on top of that. And so I think as we, at least from the vendor perspective, have seen more of that happen, we get a little bit more excited about sharing. Maybe not quite so much for just the carrier side of things, which we think will continue to have both sharing and an exclusive use spectrum, but also just broadening the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
That's very important.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay. Any more questions from the audience before we wrap up here? Anyone's got any additional questions for our members? No? Going. All right. Well, we've got a couple minutes left. I don't want to jump into one more final question and not have time to finish it up. But, well, if everybody could, I guess, join me in thanking our panel members again for some great insight. And again, I'm sure if you have more questions, you can probably tackle them up here and get your answers as well. But thanks again, guys, for the great insight. Appreciate it. And also, I need to remind everybody that your feedback is important. Please complete your session evaluations on the paper on the mobile app. You can win a $300 cash prize with that, so good luck with that. The drawing is tomorrow evening, so I'm guessing, or tonight, actually. I'm guessing you have to be here to win that. And the next session begins in 15 minutes. It'll be a very good session. Paul Kirby's going to be moderating it, so it's going to be fantastic. So stick around or grab a quick drink, come back in here. But thanks again, everybody, for participating. We appreciate it. Thanks. Well, that'll do it for this week's show. Thanks again for joining us. And make sure to check us out again next week when we dive into carrier first quarter earnings. Thanks for watching.